Which serial killers interest/scare you the most? Zodiac, the letters, the costume at the Lake Berryessa scene, the fact that the cops probably freaking had him but couldn't put all the pieces together. It was like a weird mix of motivation/ability and luck that Zodiac never got caught. There was one murder, he killed a man in a taxi cab, and as the police came, he was walking away from the scene and the police, on all likelihood, drove past him. I can't tell if that's stupid or genius. H. Holmes, reasonable-looking guy on the outside, ran a hostel full of secret passageways, hidden air ducts, and camouflaged doors. Every now and again, a guest would go to sleep in a room, and in the morning, the room would be empty. I don't think they ever found the bodies. A lot of the remains were sold to schools, I believe. He'd strip the flesh and burn it, then sell the skeleton. Not only was he the U.S.'s first serial killer, he managed to turn a profit off of it. They say if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. I'm not sure this is what someone had in mind when they came up with that saying, though. Scare me the most has to be Richard Chase for me, the Vampire of Sacramento, bad butt nickname. Didn't kill as many as other serial killers, but he has to be the most brutal killings ever recorded. He would also not break into people's houses, he would test the door to see if it was open. If it was, then he would consider himself invited. Most interesting has to be Dahmer, a lot of layers on that case. I've told this story in other places, but an aunt of mine lived across the street from the Miroth house, still does, and my then 6-year-old cousin is the one who knocked on the door and spooked Chase while he was inside killing everyone. John Wayne Gacy lived with nearly 30 bodies in his crawl space for years and years, meanwhile doing things like running for political office, being loved by neighbors, and getting special clearance to meet Lady Bird Johnson. Fritz Harman found a very ingenious way to sell meats in times of economic crisis, and he took care of a number of young men looking for work too who were last seen in his company. They called him the werewolf, the vampire, and the butcher, and they had a good reason to do so. Yang Shanhai apparently was the exact opposite of the sort of sophisticated serial killer shown in TV shows, and more of a slasher villain/monster made real. He broke into families' homes at night and axe murdered and R'd the occupants. Dang, Yang Shanghai was arrested on 3rd November 2003 and executed on 14th of February 2004. China ain't frickin' around. The ones that had known brain abnormalities or traumatic head injuries, which is very conspicuously high. Gacy, Son of Sam, Ramirez, Dahmer, BTK, and so on and so on. On paper, it reads as far too conspicuous to be coincidence. Robert Hansen, mostly because he lived in my hometown. Basically, he would kidnap strippers and other women on the edge of society, torture and R them, then fly them out into the wilderness in his small plane and hunt them for sport. Because strippers were constantly being cycled through Alaska by Seattle-based mobsters, no one really searched much if they disappeared from town. Plus, he had a facade of an upstanding citizen, and whenever the police came around, all his respectable friends defended him. Plus, as a baker, he supposedly was on good terms with many police officers who stopped at his shop. There's a pretty decent movie out there about him starring John Cusack and Nicolas Cage. That's the thing you hear about a lot of these serial killers, how they were upstanding citizens, even charismatic and well-liked. It seems to be a part of the reason why so many of them get away with it for so long, and it's just scary to think that a person you trust the most might be hiding something sinister. Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. Worst part is that Carla is now free and living in Quebec. She even has kids and regularly goes to their school. Sure, after someone has paid their debt to society by serving their term, they should be allowed to live a normal life, but she did not adequately pay her debt and deserves to be rotting in a cell. Trying to remember more clearly something I read ages ago, but there is a school of thought that she was more in control than most people, though. Evidence of how actively involved she was had been hidden by her lawyer until her plea bargain was struck. Then a video turned up of her being the aggressor in the R and murder of her sister. Can't help but feel the Unabomber had a point. However, how he went from technology is bad for humanity to let's bomb some people is pretty insane. Of course, mailing bombs to random people was straight up evil, but what he wrote in his manifesto seems to make sense to me. Of course he had a point, there's no shame in agreeing with him, it's how he handled it that most people have an issue with. Ed Kemper. The thing with him is that he is massive. Those girls didn't stand a chance. He appears as a gentle giant, but he must have been terrifying when he switched over. Even when he was arrested, if he decided he didn't want to go peacefully, he would have been difficult to stop. Rodney Alcala, the dating game appearance, is fascinating. He had already murdered multiple women and was on national TV grooming another. Few were ever that bold. I can't believe I had to go this far to find Ed Kemper. He was a monster. Nobody stood a chance against him, and the crazy part is that he's a certified genius. If you haven't seen Mindhunter on Netflix yet, it's a must-watch. The actor that plays Ed Kemper did an incredible job. Look, I already read about these things on this channel and whatnot. I'm not about to start watching these shows as well. I can only take so much into my brain before it starts to affect my sleep. I've always found Andrei Chikatilo fascinating, disturbing, but fascinating. The brutality of his crimes alongside the body count he amassed over 12 years always made me question what people are capable of. I can understand that people will do heinous things out of anger, but the fact that serial killers in general premeditate and repeat multiple times out of something other than raw, uncontrollable emotion will always fascinate and astonish me. I remember a bit from a documentary about him. Detective who was working this case dressed as a civilian was working in the park where Chikatilo sometimes attacked his victims. He saw a young girl and asked her, "Why is she alone so late?" Girl answered, "It's not your business." He replied with, "God forbid this becomes my business." Ted Bundy. That courtroom footage of him pretty much having near free reign over the proceedings, acting as his own lawyer, is kinda creepy to see. It's like there is no serial killer in the room. He blends in as a professional there. It's no wonder some of his victims didn't see how messed up he really was. Even the judge let him go to jail with a compliment and well wishes for him as if he had fallen for his manipulation. Very weird. I also find it funny that he ended up blaming adult entertainment for the reason he became a killer. That might have made a bit of sense to someone in 1989, but these days it's so laughable. His idea of adult entertainment is not the typical mainstream stuff. He referred to pulp magazines from the 30s to 50s as adult entertainment that sensationalized torturing and belittling women, most often in non-intimate ways. Jeffrey Dahmer, to be honest. He seemed to be sincerely remorseful and just wanted to die. He viewed himself as a monster. There was an honesty in that, almost a dignity, and, well, yes, he's a psychopath and probably manipulated me from the grave with that Stone Phillips interview. Same with David Berkowitz. He refused to identify a guy who almost killed him in prison because he said he deserved it after everything he'd done. He's had plenty of chances for parole, but he refused every single one. He's also a born-again Christian and said that it's helped him come to terms with his actions and accept his punishment, and he said he should never be released. See, on one hand you think they realize what they did was wrong and they feel they should pay for their crimes, and that's good, but then it's like, it's easier to accept a serial killer who isn't remorseful because then it feels like there is something deeply disturbed and wrong with them. When they're like, it was wrong, it feels like anyone could be a serial killer, and that's kind of scary. I don't know if I worded that perfectly or not, but you get what I'm saying. Not as well known as most, but Carl Panzram is the one that interests me the most. The guy basically hoboed around the country, R-ing and killing guys. Every time they locked him up, he just came out stronger and crazier. Heck, he even had a vendetta against President Taft and would have probably killed him if he was home when he broke into his house. Instead, he just stole his gun as well as some money, which he used to buy a yacht and traveled up and down the coast, R-ing and murdering guys. He also had a plan to start a war between America and England that just might have worked if he actually pulled it off. Robert Pickton, not really because of his crimes, but because of how poorly his case was handled and how many he got away with. If even one of the police officers in his area would have done a fraction of their job correctly, they could have saved dozens of lives. But none of them cared since all the missing people were prostitutes. By the way, for anyone fascinated by serial killers, I can't recommend Last Podcast on the Left enough. They've covered Pickton, Brudos, Jim Jones, Bundy, Gacy, Son of Sam, Dahmer, Holmes, Fish, Lucas, Rader, Coral, Chikatilo, Ramirez, and Chase, among others. David Parker Ray creeps me out more than just about anyone else. He would abduct young women and take them to a semi-trailer/cargo box thing that he had completely soundproofed. Inside were various instruments and contraptions that he would use to and torture his victims. When they first wake up, there would be a large mirror on the ceiling and an audio tape would play explaining what he was about to do to them and why. Namely, he felt they were S's and W's and deserved it. He didn't just them, he tied them down to a bed and would use different objects on them in different ways. No screams could be heard. He is suspected of being a serial killer, but there was never enough evidence to convict him. He was convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 128 years in prison. There are a few places where you can read/hear a transcript of the audio tape he would play before he tortured and them. It's pretty long and something I could only get about 2 pages into before realizing this might not be something I should read if I want to live a happy, healthy life. Creepiest guy I've heard of so far. Jack Unterweger. Austrian serial killer, rough childhood. He murdered a prostitute at 25 and was convicted in 1976. He learned to read and write in prison. Wrote a bestseller from prison. Convinced everyone that he was reformed and there was a movement among intellectuals to have him released early. He got released in 1990, became a celebrity, and started working as a journalist. Started murdering again almost immediately and was convicted of 9 murders in 1994. The whole thing is nuts. I'm surprised he isn't more famous. It's honestly the longest con of all time. I'm really big into rehabilitation for all kinds of crimes, as I think it is important to rehabilitate and not just punish. But you hear about stuff like this and start to question if everyone really can be rehabilitated. Is it worth the risk sometimes? Not for those 9 people. Honestly, most if not all serial killers interest me. Like, what is going through your mind that you feel the need to kill? It's fascinating to me. Charles Manson. There's something profoundly creepy about the way he programmed the family, and there's the whole killed the counterculture thing as well. He was their leader, but it was his followers that made him even worse. Tex Watson seemed truly terrifying and gave him much of his ideas. Roy Norris and Lawrence Bittaker, whose tape they made as they tortured one of their victims, was so horrifying the chief prosecutor in their case killed himself 8 months later, and is still used as a method of CIA desensitization to this day. Has anybody on here watched Mindhunters? It's on Netflix. It's a drama, not a documentary, but it's about the FBI agents that wrote the book on the criminal profiling of serial killers. Has to be Ed Kemper. Dude was 6'9", weighed over 250 pounds, and had an IQ of 145. Killed his grandparents and mother when he was 15 and did time in a psychiatric ward. Got out and killed 7 more women. Ate one of them and had intercourse with the others' corpses. The case of that Japanese girl who was kidnapped, and abused. She was kidnapped by some local teen boys who then her, set her on fire, beat her with clubs and metal, made her eat numerous things that shouldn't be eaten, etc. She lived for 80 days and at the end was basically a sack of unrecognizable meat. Junko Furuta was her name. Ugh. See, I understand people study this stuff to better understand the minds of these killers in hopes of stopping them, but I hear about stuff like this. I could never study this stuff. Just reading a few sentences about it, and I had to take a minute to myself to drink some tea and take some breaths. I don't know how folks handle any more detail. Béla Kiss is my favorite. He was this Hungarian guy who pickled people in barrels. He fought in World War I, but he deserted, and from then on people just saw him or thought they saw him in random places around the world. He even supposedly joined and deserted the French Foreign Legion. Nobody ever caught him, and no one knows where he died or if he died at all, considering the police thought he was a vampire or something. The Iceman. He would go around with a little mist bottle with cyanide, pretended to sneeze while walking by you on the sidewalk and spray you in the face. Natural reaction to getting hit with mist is to breathe in. A few moments later, you're dying on the street and he's around the corner. Marcel Petiot, 1927 to 1946. He was a French doctor and serial killer for financial gain mostly, but sometimes simply for convenience. But what really sticks with me about him is when France was occupied during the war, he told Jewish citizens he had a way to gain safe passage to South Africa for the low price of 25,000 francs per person. On the day they were supposed to travel, Marcel, going by the false name Dr. Eugene, told them the South African government required them to get shots before entering. Of course, they trusted the doctor saving their lives, and Marcel injected them with cyanide. He then took all their valuables and disposed of the body. So not just a serial killer, but also someone taking advantage of refugees during a war. You know, there's a special place in hell for all serial killers, but I feel like he's got to have a spot in the VIP area for pulling something as absolutely monstrous as that. Not quite a serial killer, but he was morbidly infamous. Ed Gein inspired several characters in horror movies such as Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs. He killed 2, maybe 3 people, but his favorite hobby was grave digging. He kept certain things from bodies and makes stuff out of them. When police searched his house, they found several vulvae, suits and masks made out of human skin, skulls fashioned into bowls, and more human skin on chair seats, and even a lampshade made out of the stuff. He was later diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he spent the rest of his life in an asylum. His family life was kinda sad, and it was speculated that his mom pushed him to do these things. His dad was an alcoholic, and his mom would make sure he was isolated and would punish him if he tried to make any friends. She'd tell him that women are evil harlots and that they weren't to be trusted. One by one, his family died, and she was the last one to pass. It was said the day she died, he lost his only friend and one true love. I learned about him from Mudvayne's song Nothing to Gain, which I think portrays him excellently. 1. Richard Ramirez. His murder spree was going on right next to where I was growing up at the time. The local news would flash the witness description, and I would have to cover my eyes. I was 7 years old at the time, and knowing this guy was killing people 2 cities over was terrifying. 2. Albert Fish. The x-ray of his groin with all the needles in it was a sight I won't forget. Guédera was a leader in Joan of Arc's army, a holy man, and lured many children to their terrible fates in his crypts. Scary because he was in a position of piety and power, and the fact that he targeted children was extra fricked up. Interesting because of how long ago it was. Holy crap, I'm an idiot. I read this as which serial killer's interest scares you the most. I was thinking, I don't know, maybe if they read a book while wearing a skin mask, that's a weird interest for them to have. Kept getting mad when no one was answering the question right. Easily Carl Panzram. Surprised to not see him posted yet. He was said to have killed at least 20, though the real number is unconfirmed, and sodomized up to 1,000 men and boys like he was as a child. Was known for the quote, "There were a lot of very nice things in the world. Among them were whiskey and sodomy." At one point actually stole President Taft's gun and money, used the money to buy himself a yacht, and sailed around the world murdering sailors with the president's .45 as he went. When he was finally imprisoned, he vowed to kill the first man that bothered him. The unlucky fellow being the laundry foreman that he beat to death with an iron bar. Many human rights activist groups tried to get his death sentence appealed, which he denied and responded to by saying he wished he could strangle them all. Out of all the killers out there known for one thing or another, no one can say they lived a life like Panzram. I believe you are correct that no one can say that. I, for one, am extremely happy no one can say that, and I hope no one else ever has cause to. Probably that Italian lady, Leonarda Cianculi. She murdered like 3 of her neighbors and made soaps/cakes out of their remains and gave them out to friends and neighbors. Paul Bernardo was the Scarborough aurist, but he never killed anyone until he met Carla Homolka. She offered up her sister as a Christmas gift for him to drug and R, but they got the dosage wrong and the sister choked to death on her own vomit. After that, they kidnapped teenage girls and videotaped themselves R-ing, torturing, and killing them. When they were caught, Carla got a sweet plea bargain by saying she was a victim of domestic abuse and offering to flip on Bernardo. Then they found the videotapes and saw that she was just as much into it as he was, but by then her plea bargain was in effect. She got released early and remarried. She has kids. There was a news story about the fact that she was volunteering for a children's organization. Carla Homolka is a terrifying freaking psycho who is currently walking the streets under an assumed name, free as a freaking bird. Sleep tight, everyone.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.